They said she was here to rebuild the team. The VP called her a visionary, a game changer. I called her something else, a loaded weapon he just handed to me. And with the right moves, I'd make sure it was pointed straight at him. 2 weeks. He'd given me 2 weeks to hand over 8 years of my life to some Silicon Valley import with a resume shinier than her actual skills. But Victor had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He'd underestimated me. My name is Madeline Ross, and I've spent 8 years building the operational backbone of Crestview Technologies, 38 years old, with enough scars from corporate warfare to know when I'm being set up for execution. That Tuesday morning at 9:30 sharp, Victor Hale's assistant summoned me to the executive floor with the kind of politeness that screams danger. Victor's office was everything you'd expect from a VP who'd been imported 6 months ago to revolutionize our company culture. Floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture that cost more than most people's cars, and a collection of business books strategically displayed, spines uncracked. Of course, he sat behind his glass desk like a king holding court, his Patek Philippe catching the morning light as he gestured for me to sit. "Madeline," he began, flashing that consultant smile he'd perfected at McKinsey or wherever they'd manufactured him. "First, I want to thank you for everything you've done for Crestview. Your dedication hasn't gone unnoticed." The setup. I'd heard this song before. "We're entering a transformative phase," he continued, his fingers steepled like he was about to deliver gospel. "The board has approved my initiative to bring in specialized talent industry disruptors who can take us to the next level." Industry disruptors. The same buzzword bullshit that had infected every tech company in the Valley. I kept my expression neutral. Years of practice serving me well. "I've hired someone extraordinary," Victor said, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a man who thought he'd just made a genius move. "Sabrina Lane. She's a team rebuilder from Next Gen Systems. You've probably heard of her work there. She completely transformed their operational structure." I had heard of Next Gen's transformation. They'd laid off 40% of their workforce and outsourced half their operations to contractors. Some transformation. "She'll be taking over your responsibilities," Victor said, as casually as ordering lunch. "But don't worry. We value your institutional knowledge. We'd like you to stay on for 2 weeks to ensure a smooth transition." 2 weeks? 8 years reduced to a 2-week knowledge transfer. "Of course," Victor added, sliding a folder across the glass surface. "There's a generous severance package, 3 months' pay, continued health benefits through the quarter. Very fair. I think you'll agree." Fair. The word tasted like ash. I opened the folder, scanning the termination agreement with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read between corporate lines. The non-disparagement clause was ironclad. The non-compete would keep me out of any meaningful position for a year. And buried on page 3, a liability waiver absolving the company of any claims related to discrimination or wrongful termination. "I'll need time to review this with my attorney," I said, my voice steady as granite. Victor's smile flickered. "Of course, but I'll need your answer by end of day Thursday. Sabrina starts Monday, and we need to maintain momentum." Momentum. Another empty word from his arsenal of corporate speak. "I understand you might be disappointed," he continued, attempting what he probably thought was empathy, but sometimes fresh perspective is what's needed. "Sabrina brings a whole new methodology, agile transformation, disruption mindset, bleeding-edge optimization strategies." Every phrase was another nail in his coffin, though he didn't know it yet. I stood, smoothing my skirt with deliberate calm. "I appreciate your transparency, Victor," I said, allowing just enough ice into my tone to make him shift in his leather chair. "I'll ensure Ms. Lane has everything she needs for a successful transition." His relief was palpable. "I knew you'd be professional about this, Madeline. That's why you've been so valuable to Crestview." Valuable. Past tense already. As I walked back to my office, my heels clicking against the polished concrete floors, my mind was already working. Victor thought he'd just executed a clean corporate assassination. He thought I'd go quietly. Another casualty of his transformation. He thought Sabrina Lane was his secret weapon. He had no idea he'd just handed me the ammunition I needed to destroy them both. Back at my desk, I pulled up Sabrina Lane's LinkedIn profile. Next Gen Systems. Senior Transformation Specialist. 2 years. Before that, 3 different companies in 4 years. A job hopper dressed up as a change agent. Her endorsements read like a who's who of buzzword bingo synergy, paradigm shifts, holistic integration. But it was what wasn't there that interested me. No specific metrics, no concrete achievements, just vague promises of revolutionary changes and unprecedented optimization. I minimized the browser and opened my secured folder, the one containing 8 years of meticulously documented processes, federal compliance procedures, and client relationship maps, the real DNA of Crestview's operations. Victor wanted a smooth transition. I'd give him exactly that, smooth as silk, and just as easy to slip on. Wednesday morning, Sabrina Lane made her grand entrance. Victor orchestrated it like a Broadway production, an all-hands meeting at 10 o'clock sharp in the main conference room, complete with catered breakfast and branded welcome packets. I watched from the back row as she worked the room. All confidence and calculated charm. She was exactly what I'd expected, mid-30s, dressed in that specific Silicon Valley uniform designer jeans, a blazer that cost more than most people's rent, and sneakers that screamed, "I'm approachable but still better than you." Her presentation deck was a masterpiece of style over substance, filled with circular diagrams and arrows pointing toward vague concepts like operational excellence and transformative synergy. "Change isn't just coming," she declared, clicking through slides faster than anyone could actually read them. "Change is here, and together, we're going to rebuild Crestview from the ground up." Rebuild. There was that word again, as if what we'd built was broken. I studied my colleagues' faces. Some looked worried they knew what rebuilding usually meant. Others, mostly the newer hires, seemed genuinely excited. They hadn't been through enough corporate transformations to recognize the warning signs. "I come from a world where we move fast and break things," Sabrina continued, apparently unaware she was quoting Facebook's abandoned motto, "where we iterate rapidly, fail fast, and pivot without ego." Pivot without ego. I almost laughed. Everything about her screamed ego, from the way she name-dropped big tech companies to how she dismissed questions with phrases like, "That's legacy thinking." But it was during the Q&A that she revealed her fatal flaw. "What about our federal compliance requirements?" asked Janet from legal. "We have strict protocols for data handling, especially with our government contracts." Sabrina's smile never wavered, but I caught the microsecond of confusion in her eyes. "Compliance is important, of course, but we can't let bureaucracy slow down innovation. We'll streamline those processes, make them more agile." Streamline federal compliance, make it more agile. She might as well have announced she'd never worked with government contracts before. I raised my hand. "Just to clarify, are you familiar with FISMA requirements or the specific DFARS clauses in our defense contracts?" "I'm familiar with compliance frameworks," she said, her tone suggesting I was being needlessly pedantic. "The principles are universal. We'll adapt as needed." Victor jumped in, eager to protect his new hire. "Madeline will ensure all critical compliance knowledge is transferred. That's why we have a transition period." After the meeting, I returned to my office and made a call to an old contact. Thomas Chen Waite. No, his name was Thomas Brennan at the Federal Contract Oversight Bureau. We'd worked together years ago when I'd helped expose a contractor who was falsifying security clearances. "Madeline Ross," he said warmly. "Been too long. Still fighting the good fight at Crestview." "For about 2 more weeks," I replied. "Quick question, hypothetically speaking. If someone with a questionable background got high-level access to federal contract data, how long before your systems would flag it?" There was a pause. "Hypothetically depends on what you mean by questionable, but our automated systems run continuous monitoring now. Why?" "Just curious about the current state of oversight. You know me, always interested in compliance." "Uh-huh." Thomas wasn't buying it, but he played along. "Well, hypothetically, if someone had prior violations or was flagged in our system, any unusual access patterns would trigger an immediate review. We've gotten very good at pattern recognition." "Prior violations," I repeated. "Like what?" "Oh, the usual. Falsified credentials, unauthorized data access, conflicts of interest that weren't disclosed. We keep a comprehensive database now. Anyone who's been flagged before gets extra scrutiny." After we hung up, I did what I did best: research. Real research. not the LinkedIn stalking I'd done earlier. I pulled up industry databases, cross-referenced employment records, and dug into NextGen's public filings from Sabrina's tenure. The first red flag appeared within an hour. NextGen had paid a substantial fine to the FTC 6 months after Sabrina joined something about unauthorized data sharing with third-party vendors. Her name wasn't directly mentioned in the public documents, but the timeline was suspicious. The second flag was even better. A former NextGen employee had filed a whistleblower complaint about falsified performance metrics in government reports. The complaint had been sealed, but the docket number was public. The date 3 months after Sabrina's transformation began. I leaned back in my chair, pieces of a plan crystallizing in my mind. Victor thought he was bringing in a visionary. What he'd actually done was invite a liability into our house, one with a history that federal oversight would find very interesting. But I needed to be careful. This couldn't look like sabotage. It had to appear as though I was being the consummate professional, doing exactly what Victor had asked, ensuring a smooth transition. I opened a new document and began typing, "Transition Plan for Operational Responsibilities." It would be thorough, comprehensive, and completely by the book. Every red flag would be packaged as standard procedure. Every trap would look like due diligence. Victor wanted his team rebuilder. He was about to learn what happened when you tried to rebuild something that wasn't broken. Sometimes the whole structure came crashing down. Thursday morning at 7:45, I arrived at the office with 2 banker's boxes and a plan. The boxes were theater. Everyone expects a departing employee to pack up their desk. What they didn't expect was what I was actually packing away: 8 years of institutional knowledge, carefully curated. I started with the obvious items. The frame certifications on my wall went into the first box. My personal coffee mug, the stress ball from a vendor conference, the small succulent that had somehow survived the fluorescent lighting, props for the performance. But the real work happened on my computer. I began transferring files to Sabrina's new shared drive, hundreds of documents, all perfectly organized and labeled: policies, procedures, contact lists, project timelines, everything she'd need to do the job, technically speaking. What I didn't include were the annotations, the margin notes explaining why certain federal auditors needed to be handled with kid gloves, the relationship maps showing which client contacts actually made decisions versus those who just attended meetings, the unwritten rules that kept our government contracts flowing smoothly. I did leave her the compliance manuals, all 47 of them, every FSMA requirement, every DFARS clause, every federal acquisition regulation that governed our contracts, 12,000 pages of dense, critical documentation that would take months to properly digest. I even highlighted the most important sections, about 3,000 pages worth. "Wow, you're thorough," Sabrina said, appearing in my doorway around 11. She surveyed my boxes with what she probably thought was sympathy. "Mind if we go over some of this together?" "Of course," I replied, pulling up the transition folder on my screen. "I've organized everything by priority. Should we start with federal compliance procedures?" Her smile tightened. "Actually, I was thinking we'd begin with team dynamics. Who are the influencers? Who needs more guidance?" "Well, you'll want to start with understanding our contractual obligations," I said, opening a particularly dense regulatory document. For instance, this DFARS 252.204/7012 clause requires us to maintain specific cybersecurity protocols. Any team restructuring needs to account for these requirements. "Right, but..." "And here," I continued, clicking through to another document, "we have our facility security clearance requirements. 30% of our team has secret clearance or above. The vetting process for any new hires takes 6 to 8 months minimum." I watched her eyes glaze over as I walked through page after page of regulations, each one more complex than the last. To her credit, she took notes, though I could see her writing getting progressively sloppier as her attention waned. "This seems extensive," she finally said. "Federal contracts," I shrugged. "The profit margins are excellent, but the oversight is intense. One violation can trigger a full audit. We had a competitor lose a $50 million contract because someone forgot to file a subcontractor disclosure form. That got her attention. $50 million. That was a small one. Our largest contract is worth $200 million over 5 years. Of course, it comes with proportional compliance requirements." I pulled up another manual. This one alone governs our supply chain verification process. By noon, Sabrina looked like someone had beaten her with a regulatory stick, but I wasn't done with the setup yet. I should introduce you to our key systems, I said, leading her to the secure server room. You'll need elevated access to manage operations effectively. Victor mentioned something about getting me admin privileges, she said, perking up slightly. Technical access was something she understood. Of course, though that requires a formal security review, standard procedure for anyone handling federal contract data. I handed her a stack of forms. Just basic background verification. Should only take a few days to process. She flipped through the papers, her confidence visibly returning. Victor said we need to move quickly. Can't we expedite this? There it was, the opening I'd been waiting for. I suppose we could request an emergency provisional access, I said slowly, as if considering it for the first time. Victor would need to sign a waiver accepting responsibility for any security breaches during the provisional period. It's not commonly done, but if he insists on speed over protocol... He does, Sabrina said quickly. Victor's made it clear that transformation can't wait for bureaucracy. I nodded, making a note in my transition log. I'll prepare the waiver, though I should mention, provisional access still appears in federal audit logs. They track all elevated permissions, especially those granted outside standard procedures. That's fine, she said dismissively. I've been through plenty of audits. I bet she had, just not the kind that ended with federal agents in the lobby. That afternoon, I sent Thomas Brennan a carefully worded email from my personal account. Nothing explicit, just a friendly heads up that Crestview was going through some organizational changes, and he might want to ensure our contracts remained in compliance. I mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that we were onboarding new senior staff with elevated system access. His response came within an hour. Thanks for the heads up. We've actually been running enhanced monitoring on all contractors since the SolarWinds incident. Any unusual access patterns get flagged immediately now. Good to know you're staying vigilant. Enhanced monitoring, immediate flags. The pieces were falling into place perfectly. I archived the email exchange in my personal files, then returned to my transition documentation. Everything needed to be perfect, helpful enough that no one could claim sabotage, but incomplete enough that Sabrina would make her own mistakes. The beauty of federal compliance was its complexity. You couldn't fake your way through it with buzzwords and confidence. Every shortcut left a digital footprint. Every waiver created a paper trail. And Victor, in his eagerness to transform Crestview with his imported genius, was about to sign his name to all of it. Friday afternoon at 2:30, Victor signed the waiver. He didn't even read it, just scrawled his signature with the same Mont Blanc pen he used for everything, as if the expensive ink could transform recklessness into leadership. I appreciate your flexibility on this, Madeline, he said, sliding the document back across his glass desk. Sabrina needs to hit the ground running on Monday. Of course, I replied, carefully placing the signed waiver into a folder marked Security Protocols, Provisional Access. Though I should document this properly, for the audit trail. Victor waved dismissively. Whatever you need to do, just make sure Sabrina has full access by Monday morning. I returned to my office and made several copies of the waiver, one for the official files, one for my personal records, and one that I scanned and uploaded to our federal compliance portal, the one that automatically synced with FCOB databases. The system would log the irregular access grant immediately, though it might take a few days for human eyes to review it. That evening, I stayed late to set up Sabrina's access credentials, but first, I did something else. I pulled her full background report from the screening service we used for all employees. Victor had fast-tracked her hiring, but the report had still come through. He just hadn't bothered to read it thoroughly. Buried on page 12 was what I'd been hoping to find. A previous employer, Data Flow Solutions, had noted a security incident during her tenure. The details were vague. Corporate reports always were, but the dates aligned with a federal investigation into unauthorized data transfers to overseas servers. Dataflow had paid a 7-figure fine and lost their federal contracting status. Sabrina's name wasn't directly tied to the incident in public records, but she'd left Dataflow 2 weeks after the investigation began, the kind of timing that suggested a quietly negotiated exit rather than a voluntary departure. I highlighted the relevant section and added it to a file labeled Onboarding Documentation, S. Lane. Then I composed an email to Victor, CCing our legal department. Per our discussion, I've granted provisional administrative access to Sabrina Lane, despite pending completion of full security clearance. Please note that Dataflow Solutions, her former employer, experienced a federal compliance violation during her tenure. See attached background report. Page 12. I recommend immediate review to ensure our contracts remain compliant. Waiver attached for your records. I scheduled the email to send Monday morning at 8:45, 15 minutes after Sabrina would have already logged into our systems for the first time. The weekend passed slowly. I spent it updating my resume and reaching out to contacts at competing firms. Word traveled fast in our industry, and several colleagues had already heard about Victor's transformation initiative. They knew what that meant as well as I did. Monday morning, I arrived at 7:30 to find Sabrina already at her new desk, my old desk surrounded by multiple monitors she'd had IT set up over the weekend. She was logged into everything: our project management system, the federal contract database, even the classified partition that contained sensitive Defense Department specifications. "Morning, Madeline," she called out cheerfully. "I've been reviewing the accounts. There's so much inefficiency here. I can see why Victor brought me in." Inefficiency. She'd been in the role for less than 3 hours and was already diagnosing problems she didn't understand. "Which accounts specifically?" I asked, maintaining a neutral tone. "Well, for instance, this aerospace contract. You have 3 different approval chains for simple purchase orders. I'm streamlining it to one." My blood ran cold, though I kept my expression steady. Those approval chains are mandated by ITAR regulations. Each one serves a specific compliance function. ITAR. She looked blank for a moment, then recovered. "Right, the export control stuff. We'll work within those parameters, of course, but there's always room for optimization." Export control stuff. She was handling weapons technology specifications and called it stuff. At 8:45, my scheduled email hit Victor's inbox. By 9:15, his assistant was at Sabrina's desk, asking her to step into his office. I could see them through the glass walls, Victor gesturing at his computer screen, Sabrina shaking her head, her confidence evaporating with each passing minute. At 9:42, my desk phone rang. It was reception. "Ms. Ross, there are 2 federal agents here asking for Victor Hale and Sabrina Lane. Should I send them up?" "They'll need to check in with security first," I said calmly. "Federal agents always do. Follow standard protocol." The 10 minutes it took for the agents to clear security felt like hours. I watched Victor's office, where he and Sabrina were now pulling files frantically, trying to understand what they'd missed. The background report I'd sent was probably open on his screen, that highlighted section about data flow burning bright. When the agents finally arrived on our floor, the entire office went silent. They were exactly what you'd expect: dark suits, serious expressions, and badges they presented to reception before walking directly to Victor's office. One of them stopped at my desk. "Ms. Ross, we understand you filed a compliance concern through the FCOB portal." "I uploaded standard onboarding documentation," I replied carefully. "Our protocols require all provisional access grants to be logged with federal oversight." He nodded. "Your diligence is noted. We'll need to speak with you after we're done with Mr. Hale." Through the glass, I could see Sabrina's laptop being placed into an evidence bag. Victor was standing now, his hands gesturing wildly as he tried to explain something. The agents remained stone-faced, taking notes. By 10:30, Sabrina was being escorted out, her provisional access revoked, her credentials deactivated. She walked past my desk without looking at me, her Silicon Valley confidence completely shattered. Victor remained in his office with the agents for another 2 hours. When they finally left, carrying several boxes of documents, he looked like he'd aged 5 years. He came to my desk afterward, his face a mix of rage and desperation. "You knew," he said quietly. "You knew about her background." "I included it in the documentation I sent you this morning," I replied evenly, "along with the waiver you signed accepting full responsibility for the provisional access." His jaw tightened. "This isn't over." But we both knew it was. Federal investigations didn't just disappear. Contracts would be reviewed, clients would be notified. the board would demand answers. And all of it could have been avoided if he'd just read page 12. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of corporate chaos that makes careers evaporate. The federal agents were back at 8 o'clock sharp, this time with a broader team and a warrant for our server access. The reception area looked like a scene from a financial crimes thriller, agents wheeling out computers, employees clustered in nervous groups, and senior management huddled in the boardroom behind closed doors. I sat at my temporary desk in the operations annex, calmly continuing my transition documentation as if the world wasn't burning around me. Every few minutes, another employee would walk by, desperate for information. "Madeline, what's happening?" Janet from legal asked. Her usual composure cracked. "They're asking for all contracts Sabrina accessed yesterday." "She accessed quite a bit," I replied, pulling up the system logs I'd been carefully monitoring. "Looks like she downloaded specifications for 3 defense projects and our entire supplier database, all within her first 4 hours. Janet's face went pale. "The supplier database has ITAR-controlled vendor information." "Yes, it does." I turned my screen so she could see the access logs. She also attempted to share several folders with an external email address. The system blocked it, of course, but the attempt is logged. "External email." Janet's voice pitched higher. "Who's?" I clicked through to the details. "Someone at a consulting firm called Transformation Partners LLC, registered in Delaware 3 weeks ago." Janet practically ran back to the boardroom. Through the glass walls, I could see her showing something on her laptop to the board members. Their expressions shifted from concern to horror. At 10:20, Thomas Brennan called my direct line. "Madeline," he said without preamble, "we need to talk about the patterns we're seeing. Can you come down to the federal building?" "I'm still employed here until Friday," I said. "Would you prefer to conduct the interview on site?" "Actually, yes. We're setting up in conference room C. 20 minutes. When I arrived at conference room C, it had been transformed into a makeshift investigation center. Laptops, document boxes, and several very serious-looking agents occupied the space. Thomas stood at a whiteboard covered in timelines and connection diagrams. "Ms. Ross," he began formally, a recorder blinking red on the table. "We need to understand the sequence of events that led to Sabrina Lane receiving administrative access to classified defense contracts." I laid out everything methodically: the sudden announcement of my replacement, the insistence on expedited access, the waiver Victor signed despite my documented concerns. I provided copies of every email, every form, every warning I'd submitted. "You seem to have anticipated this situation," one of the other agents observed, flipping through my documentation. "I've worked in federal contracting for 15 years, I replied. "I know what happens when compliance is treated as optional. I protected myself and tried to protect the company." "The company that was terminating you?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "The company whose contracts I helped build. Whatever Victor Hale thought of my value, those contracts and the people who depend on them deserved protection." Thomas nodded slowly. "We found some interesting connections. Transformation Partners LLC. It's registered to the same address as 3 other companies Sabrina Lane has been associated with. All of them formed shortly before she joined new companies. All of them dissolved within months of her departure. The pattern was clear corporate espionage dressed up as transformation consulting." "There's more," Thomas continued. "Victor Hale has a financial interest in one of those dissolved companies, small stake, but undisclosed to your board." I kept my expression neutral, but inside, the last piece clicked into place. Victor hadn't just hired Sabrina randomly. They'd worked together before, probably running the same playbook at other companies. Extract data, repackage it as consulting insights, move on before anyone noticed. "We'll need you to remain available," Thomas said. "But I should tell you, Ms. Ross, your documentation has been invaluable, your diligence in following federal protocols even during your termination. It's noted." By the time I returned to the office at 1 o'clock, the executive floor was nearly empty. Victor's office had been sealed with federal tape. The board was still sequestered in the conference room, now with legal counsel present, and Sabrina Lane was nowhere to be found, though I heard later she'd been intercepted at JFK trying to board a flight to Dubai. The afternoon brought a stream of client calls. all routed to me since I was the only operations person who understood the contracts and could speak to compliance issues. I fielded each one with professional calm, assuring them that their data remained secure and that Crestview was cooperating fully with federal authorities. Ms. Ross? The CFO appeared at my desk at 4:30. The board would like to speak with you. The boardroom felt different now, less corporate theater, more war room. The board members looked exhausted, their usual polish worn away by crisis. Madeline, the board chair began, we owe you an apology, and more importantly, we need your help. My termination is effective Friday, I reminded them. About that, the CFO interjected. Victor Hale no longer has the authority to make personnel decisions. As of 3 o'clock today, he's been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Administrative leave. Corporate speak for fired, but we need to protect ourselves legally. We'd like to discuss a new arrangement, the board chair continued. The federal investigation is just beginning. We need someone who understands our contracts, our compliance requirements, and most importantly, someone the federal agencies trust. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. I'll need to see a new contract, and my rate just went up. They didn't even blink. When your company is facing potential debarment from federal contracting, suddenly the operations director you tried to discard becomes very valuable indeed. As I left the building that evening, I passed the spot where Victor's Tesla usually sat. The space was empty except for a few drops of oil staining the concrete, the only evidence he'd ever been there at all. Wednesday morning brought the kind of spectacular corporate collapse that makes front-page news in the Wall Street Journal. I arrived at 7:45 to find news vans in the parking lot and a PR crisis team stationed in our lobby, desperately trying to control the narrative. The headline on my phone was brutal. Defense contractor under federal investigation for security breaches, VP and consultant missing. Missing, that was new. I'd barely reached my desk when Thomas Brennan called. Madeline, we have a situation. Victor Hale didn't show up for his scheduled interview this morning. His passport was used at the Canadian border around 3 o'clock. He ran. I couldn't hide my surprise. Running made everything worse from a legal perspective. Apparently, we've frozen his assets, but he had offshore accounts we're still tracking. Sabrina Lane's in custody, and she's being very cooperative, claims the whole thing was Victor's idea. Of course she did. When the ship starts sinking, everyone claims they were just following orders. The morning unfolded like a carefully orchestrated disaster. At 9 o'clock, our largest defense client called an emergency meeting. At 10, 2 more clients invoked their contract clauses requiring immediate security audits. By 11, our stock had dropped 12%. I spent the day in triage mode, working with federal agents to document exactly what Sabrina had accessed and what might have been compromised. The scope was staggering. She'd been in our systems for less than 8 hours, but had touched nearly every sensitive project we had. How did she know exactly what to target? An agent asked, looking at the access patterns. I pulled up an email thread from 2 weeks prior before I'd even been notified of my termination. Victor sent her a preliminary overview of our contracts. Look at the attachment. The agent whistled low. He mapped out your entire classified portfolio before she was even hired. Before she was officially hired, I corrected. But look at the metadata on that document. It was created 6 weeks ago. They'd been planning this for over a month. My termination wasn't about transformation or rebuilding it, was about removing the one person who would have spotted their scheme immediately. At 2 o'clock, the board called another emergency meeting. This time, they didn't summon me to the boardroom. They came to my desk, all 8 of them, including the CEO who'd been pulled back from a conference in London. Ms. Ross, the CEO began. The federal authorities tell us you're the only reason this wasn't catastrophic. Your documentation, your compliance protocols. They contained what could have been a massive breach. I was doing my job, I replied simply. The job we were terminating you from, the board chair added pointedly. We've reviewed Victor's hiring decision. There was no performance basis for your termination. None. The CFO cleared his throat. We've also discovered some irregularities in Victor's expense reports. Dinners with Sabrina Lane dating back 3 months, charged as client development. They were planning this together. Which brings us to our current problem, the CEO continued. We're facing federal audits, client reviews, and potential suspension from new contract bidding. We need someone who understands our compliance infrastructure intimately, someone the federal agencies trust. Someone like me. I kept my tone neutral, professional. We're prepared to offer you the position of Chief Compliance Officer, the CEO said, reporting directly to the board, with full autonomy over security protocols and contract compliance. The salary would be... He named a figure that was triple what I'd been making. I let them sweat for a moment. I'll need a few additions to that offer. First, a 3-year guaranteed contract with a substantial severance clause. Second, the authority to audit any hire or organizational change that affects federal contracts. Third, a written apology from the board acknowledging the improper termination attempt. Done, the CEO said immediately. Legal will have the contract ready by end of day. That afternoon, as federal agents continued their investigation, I received an encrypted email from an address I didn't recognize. The message was brief. Ms. Ross, your thorough documentation has been instrumental in uncovering a larger conspiracy involving multiple defense contractors. We'll be in touch regarding potential testimony. Your cooperation is appreciated. Department of Justice, Corporate Fraud Division. A larger conspiracy. Victor and Sabrina weren't just targeting Crestview. They were part of something bigger, something that had been systematically extracting classified defense information from multiple companies. At 5:30, as employees trickled out with shell-shocked expressions, I sat in what would soon be my new office, Victor's former space, now stripped of its pretentious furniture and federal evidence tape. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the news vans still camping in our parking lot, hungry for updates on the scandal. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas Brennan. Victor Hale arrested by Canadian authorities. Extradition in progress. Sabrina provided full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. She documented everything, including recordings of Victor planning your termination specifically to remove the compliance obstacle. You were right about everything. The compliance obstacle. That's what I'd been to them. Not a person with 8 years of dedication to the company. Not a professional who'd built the very systems they'd tried to exploit. Just an obstacle to be removed. But obstacles, I'd learned, sometimes have a way of becoming immovable objects when you try to push them aside without understanding their purpose. As I drafted my first memo as Chief Compliance Officer, outlining immediate security reforms and mandatory compliance training for all executives, I couldn't help but smile. Victor had wanted transformation. He'd wanted to rebuild our operations from the ground up. He'd gotten exactly that, just not the way he'd planned. Thursday morning, I sent the email that would seal Victor's fate permanently. Not to the authorities, they already had everything they needed. This was to the board of directors, with a CC to our legal team and a BCC to my personal attorney. Subject termination clause activation. Executive liability review. Board members. During my documentation review for the federal investigation, I've discovered a critical issue requiring immediate attention. Per Section 14.3 of our executive contracts, if any senior officer's actions result in material damage to operational capacity within 30 days of a personnel decision, the affected employee is entitled to enhanced compensation. Victor Hale's termination directive for my position was dated 2 weeks ago. The federal investigation triggered by his subsequent actions has resulted in suspension of 3 major contracts, 307 Us. Total value. Emergency audit costs exceeding 2 Ms. Stock devaluation of 18% as of market close yesterday. Preliminary DoD notice of potential debarment proceedings. This clearly constitutes material damage to operational capacity as defined in our corporate bylaws. Per my original employment agreement, the enhanced compensation clause triples my severance package and includes full vesting of all deferred compensation. Please have legal confirm the calculation and arrange for immediate payment to avoid additional liability for the company. Regards, Madeline Ross, Chief Compliance Officer. The response came within an hour, not through email, but in person. The General Counsel, Richard Blackstone, appeared in my office looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. Madeline, he began carefully, we've reviewed your contract. The clause is binding. I know, I replied. I wrote the original template for executive employment agreements 5 years ago. It was designed to protect the company from reckless leadership decisions. Richard's smile was rueful. Ironic that it's now protecting you from exactly that. The board has authorized the full payment 3 times your annual severance plus immediate vesting. It'll be processed today. Good. I'll also need Victor's termination formally documented as for cause to ensure our insurance covers the investigation costs. Already done. His actions violated at least 12 corporate policies and 3 federal regulations. We're also pursuing clawback of his signing bonus and last quarter's performance payment. That afternoon, the other shoe dropped. The FBI announced a multi-state operation targeting what they called a sophisticated corporate espionage ring operating in the defense sector. 14 individuals arrested, including Victor and Sabrina. The news coverage was relentless, each outlet trying to outdo the others with breathless revelations about the scope of the conspiracy. I watched from my office as our PR team struggled to control the narrative. They'd scheduled a press conference for 4 o'clock, and the CEO had asked me to attend, not to speak, but to be visible, the competent executive who'd stopped a crisis from becoming a catastrophe. But first, I had one more card to play. I called Margaret Winters, the chair of our compensation committee. She'd been Victor's biggest supporter, the one who'd pushed hardest for his hire despite some board members' reservations. Margaret, I thought you should know the FBI found something interesting in Victor's communications. Apparently, he'd promised Sabrina a percentage of something called performance recovery gains. Ring any bells? The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long. The forensic accountants are very interested in a consulting firm called Executive Solutions Partners, I continued. Registered in Delaware, just like Sabrina's company. The FBI thinks it might have been a vehicle for kickbacks. Of course, I'm sure you had no knowledge of Victor's connection to that firm when you recommended him. Of course not, Margaret said quickly. Too quickly. Good, because anyone who knowingly facilitated his hire despite conflicts of interest would face serious liability. The FBI mentioned something about conspiracy charges for anyone who enabled the breach. Madeline, what do you want? Your resignation from the compensation committee would be appropriate. Cite personal reasons. Effective immediately. Unless you'd prefer to explain to federal investigators why you pushed so hard for Victor, despite multiple red flags in his background check. 2 hours later, Margaret's resignation letter hit the board's inbox. The press conference was a masterclass in damage control. The CEO took responsibility while emphasizing the company's swift action once the threat was identified. He praised the unnamed employees who'd maintained compliance protocols, despite pressure to circumvent them. Everyone knew he meant me, but my name stayed out of it by my own choice. I didn't need public credit, I had something better. That evening, as I reviewed the wire confirmation for my enhanced severance payment, a 7-figure sum that would ensure I'd never have to tolerate another Victor Hale, my phone rang. It was Thomas Brennan. Thought you'd want to know, he said. Victor broke about an hour ago. Full confession. He's looking at 15 to 20 years minimum. Sabrina got 5 in exchange for her cooperation. She gave us everything: recordings, emails, the whole network. Recordings, I asked. She was smarter than Victor thought. Recorded every planning session, including one where he specifically said he needed to, and I quote, "Get rid of that compliance bitch Ross before she figures out what we're doing." That compliance bitch. I'd been called worse by better people. Thanks for letting me know, Thomas. Thank you. Madeline, without your documentation, they might have pulled it off. We've identified 4 other companies they hit successfully before trying Crestview. You're the only one who stopped them. After we hung up, I stood at the window watching the last news van pack up its equipment. Tomorrow, the story would move on to the next scandal, the next crisis. Crestview would slowly rebuild its reputation. The stock would recover. New contracts would eventually come. But Victor Hale would spend the next 2 decades in federal prison. His reputation destroyed. His assets seized. His grand transformation scheme reduced to a cautionary tale told at compliance conferences. All because he'd made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed I would go quietly. He'd assumed wrong. Friday morning, my last official day under the original termination notice, though now I walked in as Chief Compliance Officer with a 3-year guaranteed contract and enough settlement money to buy a small island. The irony wasn't lost on me. I arrived at 6:30, before the security guards had finished their shift change. before the coffee makers had started brewing in the break rooms. The office was mine alone for these precious moments, the calm after the storm. My new office, Victor's former kingdom, had been stripped of all its pretentious decoration. I'd had facilities remove everything the expensive art, the designer furniture, the wall of fake business books. In their place, I'd installed simple, functional pieces, a solid desk, comfortable chairs for visitors, and on the wall, a single-framed document, our federal compliance certification, hard-earned and nearly lost. At 8 o'clock sharp, the head of HR knocked on my door. The FBI just called. Victor's being formally charged with 18 counts of conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, wire fraud, and violation of federal defense information statutes. They wanted to thank you again for your cooperation. 18 counts, each carrying a potential 10-year sentence. Even with concurrent sentencing and plea deals, Victor would be an old man before he saw freedom again. Oh, she added. And Sabrina Lane's lawyer contacted us. She wants to know if we'll provide a character reference for her sentencing hearing. I actually laughed. Tell him we'll provide an accurate account of her actions. I doubt that's what they're hoping for. The morning brought a parade of employees stopping by to offer congratulations. Thanks. Or in some cases, apologies for not speaking up when Victor had targeted me. Janet from legal was particularly emotional. I should have said something when he announced your termination, she said. We all knew it was wrong. You'd built everything here. You had mortgages to pay, kids in college, I replied. I don't blame anyone for keeping their heads down. That's what Victor counted on, good people being too scared to resist. By noon, the final forensic accounting report hit my desk. The investigation had uncovered the full scope of Victor and Sabrina's scheme. They'd extracted classified defense specifications, proprietary algorithms, and sensitive supplier data worth an estimated $200 million on the black market. If they'd succeeded, Crestview would have been destroyed, our contracts transferred to competitors, our technology sold to the highest bidder. But they hadn't succeeded because they'd underestimated the power of someone who knew the rules, followed the protocols, and kept meticulous records. At 3 o'clock, I held my first all-staff meeting as Chief Compliance Officer. The main conference room was packed, with others dialing in from remote offices. I kept it short and direct. We survived an attack that could have destroyed this company, I began. Not through luck, but through the systems and protocols we've built over years. Victor Hale and Sabrina Lane thought those systems were obstacles to be eliminated. They were wrong. Those systems were our armor, and they saved us. I paused, looking at the faces of people I'd worked with for 8 years. Going forward, compliance isn't just a department, it's our culture. Anyone who sees something wrong has a direct line to me. Anyone pressured to violate protocols will be protected. And anyone who thinks they can bypass our systems for personal gain will learn the same lesson Victor is learning now in federal prison. The applause was genuine, not the polite corporate kind, but real appreciation from people who'd watched their company nearly destroyed by executive greed. That evening, as I packed up my things, not in bankers' boxes this time, but simply organizing my new space, I got one final call. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. Ms. Ross. The voice was nervous, young. This is Bradley Harrison from the Washington Post. We're doing a deep dive into the defense contractor espionage ring, and your name keeps coming up as the person who stopped it. Would you be willing to comment? No comment, I said automatically, then paused. Actually, tell your readers this corporate criminals count on their victims going quietly, accepting severance in exchange for silence, choosing personal comfort over justice. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be silent. Document everything, follow the rules. And when someone tries to destroy what you've built, make sure they understand that revenge isn't always about breaking the rules. Sometimes it's about knowing them better than anyone else. After I hung up, I stood at those floor-to-ceiling windows one last time, watching the sunset paint the city gold. On Monday, I'd be back, building new systems, strengthening our defenses, making sure no future Victor Hale could ever threaten us again. But tonight, I'd go home, pour myself a very expensive glass of wine paid for with Victor's money, in a poetic sense, and toast to the sweetest revenge of all surviving, thriving, and watching your enemies destroy themselves with their own arrogance. Victor had hired a team rebuilder to replace me. Instead, he'd handed me the blueprint to his own destruction, and I'd used it exactly as intended, just not the way he'd planned. Some might call it revenge. I called it justice, served at exactly the right temperature, ice cold, with a side of federal prosecution. The last text on my phone was from Thomas Brennan. Victor's extradition approved. He'll be in federal custody by Monday. Thought you should be the first to know. I smiled, turned off the lights, and walked out of my office, not Victor's, never Victor's again. Game over. I won. Thank you for listening to this story of corporate revenge and justice served cold. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below, and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale of how one woman used intelligence and preparation to defeat corporate corruption, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed similar workplace injustice? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments.